I knocked on the wrong door, but the woman who opened it might just change my life forever. It was one of those late evenings when the sky had already surrendered to night, leaving the streets quiet and empty. I had gone to my friend's house to drop off some notes he had asked me to look at, but in my usual absent-mindedness, I misread the door number. The warm glow spilling from the living room windows made it seem inviting, harmless, until I realized I had knocked at the wrong door. The sound of footsteps approaching made my heart skip a beat. The door swung open, and there she was, my friend's mom. She was standing there, mid-40s, yet effortlessly graceful, her presence commanding attention without trying. Her hair fell softly around her shoulders, catching the soft hallway light, and her eyes, sharp yet kind, met mine instantly. A faint smirk curved her lips, one that seemed both teasing and knowing. "I think you knocked at the wrong door," she said, her voice smooth, confident, but carrying a playful undertone I couldn't quite place. I stumbled over my words, my hands awkwardly clutching the papers I had brought. I'm so sorry. I didn't, I thought this was my friend's place." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow made my pulse accelerate. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and something floral, comforting but intimate, and I realized, absurdly, that I had noticed it the moment she opened the door. "Or maybe," she said, letting the pause hang, "you knocked at the right one." Her smirk deepened, eyes sparkling with mischief. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the papers in my hands rather than the sudden warmth that crept into my chest. There was something in the way she leaned just slightly against the doorframe, the casual elegance in her posture, that made it impossible to think clearly. Her presence was calm, yet every subtle movement seemed intentional, almost magnetic. I shuffled awkwardly, unsure whether I should step back or forward. She noticed, of course. With a soft chuckle, she stepped aside, motioning me in. My hand brushed hers briefly as I passed, a contact so fleeting it could have been accidental, but it lingered in my mind far longer than it did on my skin. The room, she revealed, was warm and inviting. Soft lighting spilled across comfortable furniture, small decorative touches that reflected her personality, neat, confident, yet understated. I felt out of place, a young man who had thought he was simply dropping off notes, now aware of a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. I tried to apologize again, but her smile stopped me. There was no judgment, no disapproval, only amusement and a hint of curiosity. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of vulnerability behind her confident eyes, a softness that contrasted the composed exterior. As I stood there, awkward and aware of every subtle gesture, I realized this was no ordinary wrong door encounter. There was a spark in the air, delicate yet undeniable, and for reasons I didn't yet understand, I wanted to linger just a little longer. Her smirk lingered as she closed the door behind me softly, almost deliberately, leaving me with a mixture of embarrassment, curiosity, and something much deeper that I couldn't name yet, but already felt the pull of. I didn't think I'd see her again so soon, but fate, or something far less rational, brought me back to her doorway a few days later. This time, I was armed with my friend's notes properly organized, determined to avoid another embarrassing mishap. But the moment I knocked, my pulse betrayed me. The door opened to reveal her again, leaning casually against the frame as if she had been expecting me all along. Her smirk was still there, teasing, mischievous, and it made my stomach twist with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. "Back so soon?" she asked, voice warm but carrying a sharp edge of humor that made me stumble over my greeting. Or did you finally realize this is, indeed, the wrong door? I laughed nervously, trying to match her playful tone, but my hands betrayed me, fumbling with the papers. She stepped aside, letting me enter, and my attention caught on a subtle detail I hadn't noticed before, how the soft lighting in the room highlighted the gentle curve of her jaw and the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. There was a quiet elegance to her posture, a mix of confidence and ease that made it impossible not to notice. We moved to the living room, and she gestured for me to sit. I could feel the warmth of her presence enveloping the space, calming, yet charged with a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. She watched me carefully, tilting her head as if studying me without effort, her gaze lingering just a beat too long, and I realized she was fully aware of the effect she had on me. Her hands were folded casually in her lap, but when I reached to adjust a chair slightly closer to the coffee table, our fingers brushed. I froze, the brief contact sending a jolt up my arm. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she let her hand linger near mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension between us. As we went over the notes, she teased me lightly whenever I hesitated or over-explained, her laughter gentle and infectious. Every correction, every playful remark, carried that subtle warmth, as if she were both guiding me and enjoying my discomfort. I caught myself stealing glances at the way her hair fell over her shoulder, or how she tucked it back casually, a movement so simple yet so intimate in the quiet room. She made a joke about my persistent knocking skills, and I laughed, realizing that I was entirely caught up in her presence. The conversation flowed effortlessly, but every smile, every tilt of her head, every brush of her hand against mine felt loaded with an unspoken curiosity. It was a dance, one where neither of us stepped too far, yet every movement hinted at something deeper. As I prepared to leave, she held the door open, her hand brushing mine again, slightly longer this time, and I noticed a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a subtle invitation to return, to linger, to explore the delicate tension between us. I stepped out, my heart racing, fully aware that this playful encounter had shifted something irreversibly. By the time I reached the street, I realized the wrong door had led me to something far more intriguing than I could have imagined, a connection that was equal parts mischievous, magnetic, and undeniably real. A few days later, I found myself back at her door again, not by accident this time, but with a sense of purpose I couldn't fully name. The notes had been handed over, but some inexplicable pull made me linger in the vicinity longer than necessary. When she opened the door, her smile wasn't playful this time, it was softer, warmer, and just a hint of vulnerability peeked through. "Back so soon," she said, a gentle teasing note still present, but tempered by a familiarity that immediately put me at ease. The hallway smelled faintly of her perfume again, subtle, comforting, with a trace of something floral and warm that somehow made the air feel intimate. I stepped inside, feeling the comfortable glow of her home wrap around me like a quiet embrace. We settled into the living room, and for the first time, the conversation drifted beyond casual jokes and polite explanations. She asked about my day, my studies, my thoughts on things I had barely considered important before, but her interest felt genuine, unhurried. I found myself opening up without realizing it, talking about small frustrations, fleeting moments, and even tiny victories that I normally wouldn't share. Her attention was subtle but intense. She would nod thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving mine, or tilt her head just slightly, encouraging me to continue. I noticed the soft gestures that made her seem both confident and approachable, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her fingers lightly traced the rim of her coffee cup, how a faint crease formed on her brow when she was listening intently. At one point, she reached over to hand me a pen I had dropped. Our fingers brushed, and I felt the briefest warmth of her touch. I froze for a heartbeat, then looked up to see her watching me with a small, knowing smile, as if the moment itself was significant, but unspoken. Neither of us commented, and yet the silence carried weight. As we spoke, I began to notice more subtle details, the faint scent of vanilla from the candle flickering on the table, the softness of the cushions beneath me, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. Every glance and gesture seemed layered with meaning, though unintentional, and I became acutely aware of my own reactions, the quickened heartbeat, the subtle tension in my shoulders, the magnetic pull that drew me closer to her, even in thought. She laughed softly at one of my awkward confessions, and the sound was gentle, almost musical, filling the room with ease. I realized that the connection forming between us wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, delicate, and profoundly intimate. No words were rushed, no touches forced, it was all in the small, attentive moments we shared, the tiny sparks hidden in glances, in shared silences, in fleeting contact. When I finally left, stepping out into the crisp evening air, I felt a lingering warmth from her presence, a quiet certainty that something had shifted. This connection wasn't sudden or overwhelming, it was subtle, patient, and deeply compelling. It was a moment that promised more, without demanding it, and I knew I would return, drawn by the delicate pull of this quiet, unfolding bond. A week had passed, but the memory of her smile, the quiet warmth of her presence, and the subtle tension of our last encounter lingered in my mind. I found myself walking back to her house, my steps hesitant yet determined. There was a strange comfort in knowing she would answer the door, yet an equally powerful nervousness that made my palms sweat slightly as I reached for the knob. When the door swung open, my breath caught. She stood there, as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. The soft evening light filtered through the glass panes, casting a golden glow across her features. Her eyes, bright and observant, met mine immediately, and that familiar smirk, part amusement, part invitation, tugged at the corners of her lips. "Back again," she said softly, a hint of curiosity threaded through her voice. "I'm starting to wonder if this is intentional." I laughed, trying to mask the surge of something I couldn't quite name. "Maybe it is," I said, and the words sounded braver than I felt. We moved inside, and for the first time, it felt as though the space between us carried a weight beyond casual conversation. Sitting across from her, I noticed every small detail, the graceful way she crossed her legs, the subtle curve of her neck as she tilted her head, the light shimmer in her eyes when she laughed. Each movement, each gesture, seemed amplified, drawing my attention with a magnetic pull I could neither resist nor understand. Our conversation meandered, effortlessly shifting between everyday topics and small personal reflections. I caught myself lingering on her expressions, noticing how her eyes softened when she spoke about something meaningful, how the faintest crease appeared at the corner of her mouth when she smiled. I realized that the simplest details, the way her hands rested on her lap, how she gestured while talking, carried a quiet intimacy I had never experienced before. At one point, she leaned slightly to reach for a book on the table, and our hands brushed. The contact was accidental, but neither of us moved away immediately. The touch lasted just a heartbeat longer than necessary, yet it felt deliberate, charged with unspoken acknowledgement. I felt my heart quicken, a warm tension radiating from my chest down to my fingertips. There was a pause in the conversation, a shared silence that wasn't uncomfortable but loaded with unspoken awareness. Our eyes met, holding longer than usual, and I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and hesitation. She caught my glance, and for a moment, it felt as if time slowed. The room, the evening light, even the soft hum of distant traffic faded into the background. All that remained was the subtle, electric awareness of each other's presence. When she laughed again, soft and melodic, I realized I was acutely aware of every nuance, every flicker of her expression, every breath, every movement. The playful tension from our first encounters had matured into something deeper, more resonant. Something intimate yet restrained, gentle yet impossible to ignore. As I left that evening, walking down the quiet street, I replayed her glances, her subtle touches, her soft laughter. The connection between us was no longer fleeting curiosity, it was becoming a tangible, almost magnetic force. A quiet promise lingered in my mind, this was only the beginning, and every encounter would pull us closer, in ways both thrilling and forbidden. I had arrived at her door that evening feeling a mix of anticipation and quiet apprehension. There was a weight in my chest I couldn't fully explain, a sense that tonight's conversation might drift beyond the playful banter of previous visits. When she opened the door, her smile was soft, welcoming, and for the first time, edged with a hint of vulnerability. The warm glow from inside invited me in, and I stepped over the threshold with a heart that felt both heavy and light. We settled into the living room, the familiar warmth of the space making it easy to forget the rest of the world. The faint scent of vanilla from a candle mingled with the floral undertones of her perfume, creating a subtle, intimate cocoon. The evening was quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional creak of the floorboards under our movement. Our conversation started lightly, as usual, but gradually it shifted. She paused mid-sentence and looked down, as though gathering courage to share something personal. "I don't often talk about this," she admitted, voice low, almost hesitant. "But there are moments when you wonder if you've lived your life the way you should have, or if you've missed something important." I felt my pulse quicken. There was no pretense in her words, no attempt to soften the edge of her honesty. She was exposing a part of herself I hadn't seen before, the quiet, unguarded truth behind the composed, confident exterior. My instinct was to reassure her, to let her know that her words were heard and her feelings mattered. "I think everyone feels that sometimes," I said softly, careful not to intrude but wanting her to know she wasn't alone. "Even if we don't admit it." Her gaze lifted to meet mine, and there was a weight in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a subtle, unspoken connection. The moment stretched, filled with an almost tangible intimacy. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing her neck in a nervous gesture that somehow felt incredibly human, incredibly real. I reached for the small object she had dropped earlier, a pen that rolled across the table, and our hands brushed. Just a fleeting touch, a subtle graze, yet the warmth that spread through me felt undeniable. She didn't pull away immediately, instead, her fingers lingered near mine, as if acknowledging the unspoken bond between us. For the next hour, we talked, not about work or school or trivial matters, but about life, choices, regrets, and fleeting joys. She shared stories of her past with a frankness that was both disarming and comforting. I listened, offering empathy, silent acknowledgement, and occasional soft laughter where it fit. The conversation was a dance of vulnerability, a slow, careful weaving of trust and emotional intimacy. By the time I left, the evening had left its imprint on both of us. The tension between us had shifted, no longer just playful or charged with curiosity, but deeper, richer, and more profoundly human. The warmth in my chest lingered, a reminder that what had begun as a simple, accidental encounter was evolving into something far more meaningful. I stepped into the night, aware that this fragile, quiet connection had grown into a bond neither of us could ignore, a shared intimacy that neither words nor gestures could fully contain. The days after our last meeting felt strangely suspended, as if the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. Every time I thought of her, I felt that familiar warmth in my chest, the quiet pull that had been growing with each encounter, but it was now mingled with hesitation and an almost guilty awareness of the age gap, the social boundaries, and the unspoken rules I felt compelled to respect. When I found myself walking up to her door again, I carried more than just papers or idle curiosity. I carried a quiet tension, an internal battle between desire and propriety. My hand hovered over the door handle longer than necessary, heart thudding with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. When the door opened, she was there, as though she had been waiting, though her smile was soft, patient, and touched with knowing. "Good to see you," she said, her voice warm yet measured. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd decided to avoid me." I chuckled, though my nerves betrayed me. "Avoid you? Never. Just thinking too much, I guess." The playful banter that had once defined our interactions was now layered with something heavier, something more intimate. As we moved into the living room, I became acutely aware of her presence, the subtle sway of her posture, the quiet elegance in how she moved, the soft rustle of her clothes as she crossed her legs. Every detail drew my attention, and I realized I was hyper-aware of the physical space between us, the fleeting touches, the way our hands occasionally brushed. As we talked, the conversation grew quiet, punctuated by pauses where neither of us knew exactly what to say next. I noticed the way her eyes lingered on me, thoughtful and searching, as if she were trying to gauge the depths of my feelings. And I found myself studying her with equal intensity, noticing the faint lines around her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the subtle warmth radiating from her presence. At one point, she reached over to adjust a cushion for me, and our fingers touched briefly. The contact, though fleeting, carried a weight neither of us ignored. I felt an electric charge run up my arm, and when our eyes met, there was a flicker of acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding of the tension that had quietly taken root between us. Yet the conflict lingered. I reminded myself of the societal expectations, of the complications inherent in our connection, yet I couldn't ignore the deep emotional pull drawing me closer. She, too, seemed caught between restraint and desire, her movements careful but her gaze betraying a longing I felt mirrored in my own. We laughed lightly to break the tension, but beneath it lay a current of something more profound. Every word, every subtle gesture, every lingering glance felt charged with unspoken meaning. The playful tension of the past had evolved into an emotional complexity neither of us could deny. As I left that evening, walking into the quiet street, I felt the weight of our connection pressing gently against me, a magnetic pull I could neither resist nor fully act upon. I realized that we were both painfully aware of what we felt, yet equally aware of the boundaries we had to respect. And in that delicate balance between desire and propriety, I understood that our story was reaching its most fragile, most potent point. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the nearby garden, when I found myself once again at her door. Unlike the nervous anticipation of our first encounters, This visit felt different, charged with a quiet understanding of what had passed between us, and the unspoken connection that had grown steadily over weeks. I hesitated for a moment, hand resting lightly on the doorknob, feeling the weight of everything we had shared. When she opened the door, her smile was both familiar and new, softer, warmer, edged with a subtle relief that mirrored my own. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, voice gentle, with that playful undertone that had always made my pulse quicken. Yet there was also something deeper in her gaze, a recognition of the bond we had built and the complexity of our feelings. We moved into the living room, the space bathed in the soft glow of warm lamps, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the evening air. I noticed every detail, the gentle curve of her shoulders, the way she settled comfortably into her chair, the small movements that revealed her unspoken emotions. Our conversation began lightly, then gradually shifted to more honest, intimate reflections on life, choices, and the strange, unexpected connections that sometimes change us in profound ways. She shared a quiet story from her past, a regret that lingered but had shaped her, and I listened, offering empathy and understanding. I reached over at one point to hand her a small item she had dropped, and our fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, but it felt significant, grounding us in the moment. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, her hand lingered near mine, a subtle acknowledgement of the emotions that neither of us had yet fully named. For the first time, we addressed the tension that had quietly existed between us. I spoke carefully, honestly, about how our connection had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated, how her presence had become a source of warmth and reflection, how I valued the trust and intimacy we had nurtured. She responded with equal sincerity, acknowledging the depth of our feelings while recognizing the boundaries that still existed. There was a pause, a shared silence filled with understanding. I reached out, this time deliberately, taking her hand gently in mine. She allowed it, and the warmth of her touch was both comforting and electrifying. Our eyes met, lingering longer than words could express, and in that gaze, we communicated everything we felt: respect, affection, admiration, and the fragile promise of something more. We parted that evening with a gentle hug, lingering just long enough to convey all that remained unspoken. There was no dramatic declaration, no impulsive leap, only a shared understanding of the bond we had formed. We both stepped back, smiling softly, hearts lighter yet deeply aware of the connection that would continue to shape us. As I walked down the quiet street, the night air wrapping around me, I realized that this was not an ending but a resolution. Our story had reached a point of emotional fulfillment. We were together in understanding, in respect, and in unspoken affection, together but with a careful awareness of the complexities we faced. And in that gentle balance, I felt a quiet joy, knowing that some connections are powerful not because they're acted upon immediately, but because they leave an enduring mark on the heart.